The paper shook in Walter Finley's hand. Not from the wind that cut across the Kansas plain that October morning in 1882, though the wind was fierce enough to rattle the shutters of the farmhouse before him. Not from the cold, though frost still clung to the dead grass at his boots. The paper shook because Walter Finley, deputy sheriff of Colton County, had just read something that made his gut drop straight through the earth beneath him. He had ridden out to the Lawson property with one purpose and one purpose only. Sheriff Dade Greer had handed him the eviction notice 2 days ago with a grin that looked more like a threat than a smile, and Walter had taken it because that was his job. Serve the notice. Clear the widow off the land by sundown Friday. Simple as that, except nothing about this was simple anymore. The woman standing on the porch of that farmhouse, dark-haired, straight-backed, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a rifle leaning against the doorframe that she clearly knew how to use, had not wept when he rode up. She had not begged. She had not shrunk back into the shadows of her grief the way he had expected a widow to do. Instead, Anna Lawson had walked down those porch steps with a leather satchel tucked under one arm and a ledger pressed against her chest like it was armor, and she had said, in a voice that did not tremble one single degree, "Before you hand me that paper, deputy, I suggest you look at what I have in my hand." Now he had looked, and the world had shifted on its axis. The documents were meticulous. 3 years of land payment receipts, every one signed and dated, every one bearing the stamp of the Colton County Land Office. A deed of clear title filed in her late husband's name, registered in Abilene, that directly contradicted the fraudulent claim filed by Harlan Morse, the man who owned half this county and apparently wanted the other half too. And beneath all of that, a surveyor's report, accurate, detailed, and utterly damning, drawn up in Anna Lawson's own hand. Walter looked up from the documents and stared at her. She stared back, and she did not flinch. He looked down at the eviction notice in his other hand. The official seal of Colton County, the signature of Sheriff Greer, the name of Harlan Morse typed neatly as the complaining party. Walter Finley had served in this county for 4 years. He had tracked outlaws across open prairie, faced down armed men in saloon doorways, ridden through blizzards to deliver justice to places that had never seen much of it. He was not a man who rattled easily, but his hands were shaking. He tore the eviction notice in half. The 2 pieces caught the October wind and sailed across the dead grass like broken birds, and Anna Lawson watched them go with an expression that was not triumph, not relief, but something far more complicated, something that looked, Walter thought, very much like the face of a person who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had finally, at great cost, allowed themselves to exhale. "You just tore up an official county document," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," Walter said. "I did." He had not known, when he woke up that morning, that this day would change everything about the life he had been living. He had not known that the woman standing before him on this windswept Kansas farm would become the most important person he had ever met. He had not known that the simple act of tearing a piece of paper would set into motion a chain of events that would strip bare every secret in Colton County, put his badge on the line, and lead him, eventually, to a place he had never expected to find himself. He had not known any of that. But looking at Anna Lawson, standing on the frost-hard ground of a farm she had kept alive through 2 years of widowhood by sheer intelligence and force of will, he felt something crack open inside his chest. He would figure out what that feeling was later. Right now, they had a problem, and the problem's name was Harlan Morse. 6 weeks earlier, Walter Finley had ridden into Colton, Kansas, with a reputation that had preceded him by about 3 counties. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled at the collar and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled out of Red Rock Canyon. He had served as a deputy in 2 different counties before this one, and his record was clean: no corruption, no cruelty, no bending of the law for personal gain. He was the kind of lawman who ate his meals alone because he kept his distance from everyone, who gave up his coat to a shivering drunk on a cold night without saying a word about it, who trusted the law because the law was the only thing that made the frontier livable. Sheriff Dade Greer had hired him because Colton County had been suffering from a rash of cattle theft and 2 unexplained fires on smaller farms. Walter's reputation as a tracker made him useful. What Greer had not told him and what Walter had not yet figured out was that the cattle theft and the fires were not random, they were a method. Harlan Morse had been buying up land in Colton County for 6 years. He had started with legitimate purchases, dryland farms whose owners had run out of water or luck. And then, as his ambition grew faster than his patience, he had started using other means: pressure, fear, manufactured debt, and when those did not work, fires. The smaller farmers had been leaving steadily, one family at a time, selling out to Morse at whatever price he named because the alternative was worse. But there were holdouts. There were always holdouts in Kansas. Anna Lawson was the most stubborn of them. Her husband, Thomas Lawson, had died of fever 18 months before Walter arrived in Colton. He had left Anna with 160 acres of prime bottomland, a farmhouse, a barn, a small herd of cattle, and 3 horses. He had also left her with a daughter named Clara, who was 5 years old, and a signed and recorded land deed that was absolutely, legally, and completely hers. None of that had stopped Harlan Morse from deciding he wanted it. What Morse had not counted on was Anna Lawson herself. She had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a civil engineer and a school teacher. Her father had taught her mathematics, surveying principles, and the practical science of land measurement from the time she was old enough to hold a compass. Her mother had taught her to read everything, to remember everything, and to never trust a man who smiled while he talked about money. She had married Thomas Lawson at 24, moved west with him at 25, and spent 3 years learning every inch of the Kansas frontier with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything else. When Thomas died, Anna did not collapse. She grieved, she grieved in the private dark of the farmhouse after Clara was asleep, with a grief that was so large it sometimes seemed to fill the entire sky, but she did not collapse. She learned to do everything Thomas had done, and she learned to do it better than most men would have, because she was meticulous and relentless, and she refused to let his death mean the end of what they had built together. She kept the cattle fed. She kept the farm running. She kept the records. The records were her weapon. When the first letter from Morse's lawyer arrived, claiming that the Lawson land deed had a flaw in its registration, Anna had pulled out the original deed and spent an entire night comparing it against the county land records she had obtained from the clerk in Abilene. The flaw was fabricated. She could prove it. She had written back to Morse's lawyer with a 14-page response that cited specific sections of Kansas territorial land law, attached copies of every relevant document, and ended with a single sentence: "If you file this claim, I will make certain that every piece of evidence I have compiled reaches the circuit judge before you do." The lawyer had not responded. Then came the second letter and the third. Then a man on horseback had come to her gate one night, said nothing, and dropped a dead crow on her fence post before riding away. Then her neighbor to the north, a farmer named Elias Bunch, had sold his property to Morse after one of his barns mysteriously caught fire. The message was clear. Anna Lawson had not moved. She had instead done something remarkable. She had begun surveying, not just her own land, all of it. She had borrowed her father's old surveying equipment, a transit, a measuring chain, a set of steel pins, from the crate she had kept in the barn since moving west, and she had spent every spare hour of the growing season walking the county lines, measuring lot boundaries, comparing them against the original government land survey plats she had obtained by writing directly to the General Land Office in Washington. What she found, over those long weeks of methodical, solitary work, was a pattern. Morse's property acquisitions were geographically deliberate. He was building a corridor, a strip of land running from the northern ridge of the county down to the river, a corridor that would give him exclusive access to the only reliable water source in the region during a drought year. Every farm he had bought or pressured into selling sat along this corridor, and the Lawson bottomland sat directly in the middle of it. Without Anna's 160 acres, Morse's corridor was broken. With it, he would control the water for 3/4 of the county. She had documented all of this: maps, measurements, deed references, acquisition dates. It was a complete and meticulous account of a conspiracy to monopolize the county's water supply, and it was all drawn up in Anna Lawson's precise, elegant hand, on paper that bore the watermark of the finest stationery available in Abilene. She had been preparing for the moment someone tried to take her land. What she had not been prepared for was Walter Finley. On the day he first came to her property, not with the eviction notice, but 3 weeks before that, responding to a report that one of her cattle had been found dead near the fence line, possibly shot, Walter had ridden up on a bay horse and introduced himself with the straightforward, economical manner of a man who did not waste words. He had examined the carcass. He had looked at the ground. He had asked her 2 questions and listened to both answers with an attention she was not accustomed to receiving from men wearing badges in this county. Any strangers on the road recently, he had asked. "One," she had said. "3 nights ago. He didn't say anything. He left something on my fence post and rode on." What did he leave? A dead bird. Walter had not said that was strange, or that she must be imagining things, or that widows on their own sometimes got spooked. He had nodded, looked at the road, and said, "I'll look into it." Then he had tipped his hat and ridden away. Anna had stood in the yard for a long moment after he left, watching the dust settle behind his horse, feeling something unfamiliar stir beneath her practical, defended exterior. She had pushed it down immediately. She did not have room for unfamiliar feelings. She had a farm to run and a conspiracy to document and a child to protect, but she had noticed him. It would be dishonest to say she had not. Walter had, on his part, ridden back toward town in a state of mild confusion that he could not entirely explain. He had talked to a lot of people in his work. He was good at reading people. He could usually tell within 5 minutes whether someone was scared, lying, hiding something, or telling the truth. Anna Lawson had been all of those things simultaneously in a way that was deeply unusual, truthful about the facts, but clearly holding something larger in reserve, frightened at some deep interior level but showing not one flicker of it on the surface, and absolutely, completely, without any question, in full possession of every detail of her own situation. He had done what she could not, ridden the road and looked for tracks. He had found them. 2 horses, one shod with a distinctive pattern he recognized from the livery in town. He had filed the information away and said nothing to Greer, because something about Greer's easy dismissal of the widow's complaints had begun to sit wrong with him. Over the following 2 weeks, as the October air turned sharp and the harvest came in on the remaining farms, Walter found himself riding past the Lawson property more often than his duties strictly required. He told himself it was patrol. He told himself he was watching for suspicious activity in the area. He was not entirely honest with himself. He saw her once in the east field, walking a line with a measuring chain extended, her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a notebook in her left hand and a steel pin in her right. She was working with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, and there was something in the sight of her, the solitary figure, the careful competence, the absolute self-containment, that struck him harder than he wanted to admit. He did not stop. She did not see him. But he thought about her that night as he sat in the small room above the livery that passed for his lodging, eating cold beans from a tin and staring at the ceiling, and the thinking he did was not professional and was not entirely comfortable. On the 2nd week of October, Harlan Morse had come to the sheriff's office. Walter had been at his desk when Morse walked in, and the first thing he felt in the man's presence was the particular kind of discomfort he associated with someone who wore power like a coat they had stolen off a larger man. Morse was 50 years old, lean and weathered in the way of a man who had worked hard in his youth and spent the subsequent 20 years making other people work hard on his behalf. He had pale gray eyes that assessed everything with the quick, transactional focus of a man who was always calculating profit. He had sat down across from Sheriff Greer without acknowledging Walter's presence at all, which told Walter everything he needed to know about how Morse viewed deputies. "The Lawson woman," Morse had said. "I want it dealt with." Greer had leaned back in his chair with the comfortable ease of a man who owed someone a large favor. "She's been notified of the deed irregularity." "Notification isn't enough. I want the property cleared, file the eviction." Walter had kept his eyes on his paperwork. His pen had gone still. "It'll take a few days to process the paperwork," Greer said. "You have until Friday," Morse said. He stood up. He picked up his hat. "I don't need to explain what's at stake, Dade. You know the arrangement." He had left without looking at Walter once. After he was gone, Greer had been quiet for a moment, then turned to Walter with the lazy authority of a man who knew his orders would be followed. "Finley, I'll need you to serve an eviction notice at the Lawson property Friday morning. The woman's deed has a registration problem." "County's reclaiming the land." Walter had looked up from his desk. "What kind of registration problem?" Greer had smiled the smile that was also a warning. "The kind that means she doesn't own it anymore. That's all you need to know." Walter had nodded. He had said nothing. He had taken the eviction notice when Greer handed it to him 2 days later and folded it into his coat pocket. And then he had done something that he had not done in 4 years of law enforcement. He had gone looking for information outside the official channels. He had ridden to Abilene the day before he was supposed to serve the notice. He had gone to the county land office and asked to see the deed registry for the Lawson property. The clerk, a small, nervous man named Hutchins who seemed accustomed to being asked for things in ways that discouraged questions, had shown him the file. The deed was registered. The registration was complete. There was no irregularity, but there was something else. Filed 3 days ago, right on top of the original deed, was a secondary claim, a document asserting that the original registration had been made in error and that the property had reverted to territorial ownership as a result of a survey discrepancy. The document bore no surveyor's stamp. It was not signed by anyone Walter could identify. It referenced a survey that, when Walter asked to see the survey file, turned out not to exist. The claim was fabricated. Walter had stood in the land office with this knowledge burning in him, and he had thought, very carefully, about what to do next. He was a deputy in Colton County. His sheriff had told him to serve this notice. His sheriff was clearly in an arrangement with the man who had filed the fraudulent claim. If he refused to serve the notice, he would lose his badge. If he served it, he would be the instrument of a woman's illegal dispossession. He had ridden back to Colton that evening in a state of silent internal conflict that did not resolve itself until the following morning, when he pulled up in front of the Lawson farmhouse on the frost-hard ground, and Anna Lawson walked down her porch steps with her leather satchel and her ledger and said, "Before you hand me that paper, deputy, I suggest you look at what I have in my hand." And he had looked. And now the eviction notice was blowing across the dead grass in 2 pieces, and Walter was standing in Anna Lawson's yard with his heart beating considerably faster than usual. "You should come inside," Anna said. Her voice was composed, but there was an undercurrent of something urgency, perhaps, or the beginning of something she was also trying to control. "What I showed you is only part of it. There's more. And if you just tore up that notice, Greer is going to know before sundown that something has changed." "He'll know by noon," Walter said. "He'll send someone to check. Then we don't have much time." He tied his horse at her fence post and followed her up the porch steps and into the farmhouse. The interior of the Lawson home was ordered in a way that spoke immediately of Anna's mind. Bookshelves flanked the fireplace, filled not with decorative volumes but with practical ones, surveying manuals, agricultural texts, legal references, a worn copy of the Kansas statutes. A drafting table stood near the window that faced east, its surface covered with maps so detailed and precise that they stopped Walter cold the moment he saw them. He crossed to the table without thinking about it. He stood over the maps and looked at them for a long moment before he realized his mouth was slightly open. They were extraordinary. Drawn by hand on large sheets of drafting paper, they showed the entire county in a level of detail he had never seen in any official survey: every farm boundary, every land grant, every water feature, every acquisition color-coded and cross-referenced with a legend in the corner. And there in the center of the map, traced in red ink, was the corridor he had not known about. "You surveyed all of this," he said. It was not a question. "Over the course of 8 months, yes," Anna said. She had set her satchel on the table and was opening it, pulling out more documents. "My father was a civil engineer. He taught me to use a transit and a measuring chain when I was 12. What you are looking at is a complete survey of Harlan Morse's land acquisitions in this county over the past 4 years, cross-referenced against the original government survey plats and the deed registry in Abilene." Walter looked at her. "You wrote to the General Land Office in Washington." She glanced up at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because I went to Abilene yesterday and looked at your deed file. The claim Morse filed references a survey that doesn't exist. I looked for it. There's no survey record, no surveyor's stamp, no chain of custody. He invented it." The look she gave him then was not what he expected. It was not gratitude, though that came a half-second later. First, it was assessment, the quick, precise evaluation of a woman who had learned not to trust too quickly and was measuring him against some internal standard she had developed through hard experience. He held her gaze and let her measure. "You went to Abilene," she said slowly. "On your own time, before you served the notice." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He considered the question. "Because something about this smelled wrong from the beginning, and because I don't work for Harlan Morse." Another measuring look. Then she said, "Sit down, Deputy Finley. I'm going to show you everything I have, and then you're going to tell me what you plan to do about it." He sat, and she began. For the next 2 hours, Anna Lawson laid out the most comprehensive account of systematic land fraud Walter had ever encountered. She worked through the documents with the methodical precision of a trained surveyor and the strategic clarity of someone who had spent months thinking about how to present this evidence to exactly the right person. She showed him the acquisition timeline, the payment records, the fraudulent secondary claim, the non-existent survey. She showed him the water access implications illustrated on her map with blue ink, the river, the tributaries, the drought patterns she had tracked for 2 seasons, the precise mathematical projection of what Morse's water monopoly would mean for every remaining independent farmer in the county. She showed him letters. Letters from Morse's lawyer, politely threatening. Letters from county officials, suspiciously unhelpful. And one letter she had saved for last, which she placed before him with particular care. A letter from a land speculator in Dodge City, addressed to Harlan Morse, that had been delivered by mistake to the Lawson mailbox because the sender had transposed 2 numbers in the road address. The letter discussed the corridor specifically, using that exact word, and referenced an anticipated completion date once the final obstacle was removed. Walter read that letter twice. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 2 weeks, Anna said. "I've been waiting to understand where to take it. Circuit Judge Marcus Thorne comes through Colton in November." "That's 3 weeks away," Walter said. "Morse won't wait that long. He already pushed Greer to move on the eviction. If I ride back to Colton without having served this notice, Greer will know something happened, and he'll find another way to pressure you off this land before November." Clara appeared at the doorway to the back room just then, 5 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's easy smile, holding a cloth doll against her chest. She looked at Walter with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. "Mama," she said, "is that man the law?" "He is," Anna said. Clara considered this. "Is he going to make us leave?" The silence in the room was the particular kind that contained several things happening at once, most of them beneath the surface. Walter looked at the little girl and felt something tighten in his chest with an almost physical force. "No," he said. "Nobody is making you leave." Clara nodded as if this were simply confirmation of something she had already decided. "Good," she said, and disappeared back into the room. Anna watched the empty doorway for a moment. When she turned back to Walter, her composure was still in place, but something behind her eyes had shifted slightly, something more vulnerable, more exposed. She had been doing this alone for a year and a half. She had been holding this together by sheer force of intelligence and will, and she was exhausted, and she was afraid, and she was not going to say any of those things because saying them would make them real. Walter saw all of this. He said nothing about it because he understood that she did not want it named, but he felt the full weight of what she had been carrying, and it settled onto him with a seriousness that surprised him. "Here is what I think we should do," he said. He leaned forward over the maps, and she leaned in beside him, and the space between them was small enough that he could smell the clean, cold morning scent of her hair, and he registered this information and set it firmly aside. "The circuit judge is our target. 3 weeks. The evidence you have is substantial enough to not only void the fraudulent claim, but to bring criminal charges against Morse and possibly Greer as well. But we need to keep you safe and on this land until the judge arrives." "Greer will send someone else to serve the notice," Anna said. "He might, or he might come himself, or Morse might try something more direct." Walter straightened. "Do you have any neighbors still in the area you trust?" Anna thought. "The Beaumont farm 3 miles east. Jacob Beaumont hasn't sold. He has 3 grown sons. And Sarah Aldridge to the south, she's a widow too, but her brother lives with her." "Good. We need people who can testify to the pattern, who have seen or experienced pressure from Morse. Do you think Beaumont would talk to a judge?" "Jacob Beaumont has been furious about this for 2 years," Anna said with a dryness that was the first hint of something approaching humor he had heard from her. Getting him to stop talking to the judge might be the greater challenge. Walter felt the corner of his mouth move before he stopped it. He stood up and picked up his hat. "I need to go back to town. I need to manage what Greer knows and doesn't know, at least for the next few days. I'll tell him I served the notice and there was no incident. That buys us some time." "You'll lie to your sheriff," Anna said. "It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation delivered without judgment, though he could see her thinking through its implications." "I'll tell him I handled the situation," Walter said. "Which is true." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "Why are you doing this, Deputy Finley? You have nothing to gain. If Greer finds out you're working against Morse's claim, you lose your badge." "Possibly more than that." He picked up his hat. He turned it once in his hands. He thought about how to answer that honestly without saying more than he should. "Because what Morse is doing is wrong," he said. "And because the law is the only thing that makes any of this livable out here. If I use it to serve the wrong instead of the right, it isn't worth carrying." He paused. "And because I went to Abilene yesterday and I know the claim is fraudulent, and I know you know it's fraudulent and you have everything you need to prove it, it would be a moral failing to walk away from that." She held his gaze. He held hers. Something passed between them that neither of them named, because it was too new and the situation was too urgent, and they were both people who held things carefully before speaking them aloud. "I'll be checking in on the property," he said. "Patrol purposes. If anyone comes with a notice or any other kind of pressure, send Clara to the Beaumont farm with a note, and I'll know about it within the hour." "You're making a lot of promises for a man who might not have a badge by next week," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know." He rode back to Colton with the October wind at his back, and the pieces of the eviction notice were somewhere behind him in the dead grass, and the decision he had made was the clearest and also the most complicated one he had made in his life. Greer was in the office when Walter returned, leaning over a map of his own, a crude, sketched thing that bore no resemblance to the precision of Anna Lawson's work. He looked up when Walter came in. "Well," Greer said. "Handled," Walter said. He hung up his coat. He sat at his desk. His heart was beating steadily and his face was composed, and he had been lying since his 4th year of life to people who expected different things from him. So the lie, if it was a lie, which technically it was not, sat on him without visible weight. Greer studied him for a moment. "She give you any trouble?" "No more than expected," Walter said. Greer made a satisfied sound and turned back to his map. "Morse will want confirmation by Monday." "Monday's fine," Walter said. He spent the rest of that day and all of the weekend that followed doing 3 things. First, he rode to the Beaumont farm and spoke to Jacob Beaumont for 2 hours, laying out the situation in broad strokes and learning that Beaumont had not only witnessed the intimidation tactics, but had kept his own records, rough ones. Nothing like Anna's precision, but corroborating in their dates and their descriptions. Second, he wrote a long, careful letter to Judge Marcus Thorne in Wichita, explaining the nature of the fraud and the evidence in hand, and asking whether the judge's circuit schedule could be accelerated to the first week of November. He sealed this letter and sent it by a writer he trusted, not through the town post office where Greer had a contact. Third, he made 2 more visits to the Lawson property. The first visit was on Saturday afternoon, and it was genuinely a patrol visit. He had spotted unfamiliar horse tracks on the road near her north fence line and wanted to check them out. He found Anna in the barn, which was where the second extraordinary discovery of his growing catalog of Anna Lawson's capabilities occurred. She was shoeing a horse. Not awkwardly, not hesitantly, not in the manner of someone who had been forced to learn a skill out of desperation and had muddled through it. She was shoeing the horse with confident efficiency, the hoof held between her knees, the rasp working the edge clean, a new shoe waiting on the forge she had clearly built or repaired herself in the corner of the barn. The horse, a gray mare of considerable personality, was standing with a patience that suggested it had been through this process before and trusted her. Walter stood in the barn doorway and watched for a full 30 seconds before she looked up. "The tracks," she said without stopping her work. "2 horses. I noticed them at first light. I don't recognize the shoe pattern." He crossed to the barn and crouched to look at the shoe she had just removed. He looked at his own mental notes from the road. He stood up and said, with less control over his voice than he would have preferred, "You shoe your own horses." "Thomas's farrier left the county 2 winters ago," she said, straightening and setting the hoof down, reaching for the hot shoe with tongs. "A horse without a shoe on Kansas ground is a horse that can't work. I learned." She fit the shoe to the hoof with an expert's eye, made one small adjustment at the forge, and returned to apply it. The sound of the hammer rang clean and steady in the cold barn air. Walter had been around horses and the people who worked with them his entire life. He knew what good shoeing looked like. He knew what it took, the strength, the technique, the read on the animal's comfort. He stood in that barn and watched Anna Lawson finish the job with a precision and competence that genuinely shocked him in a way he had not been shocked since he was a young man, and the shock was not condescending. It was the simple, immediate recognition of someone encountering a skill level they had not anticipated. She looked up and caught him staring. He did not look away. "That is excellent work," he said. She studied him for a moment. Most people, when they said something like that to her about something like this, said it with a particular inflection, a note of surprise that also contained its opposite, a condescension dressed in admiration. Walter's voice contained neither. It was a direct, factual assessment, the kind one professional might give another. Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle and it was brief, but he caught it, a softening, the almost invisible lowering of a wall that had been standing for a long time. "The tracks," she said, wiping her hands on her work apron. "Do you know whose horses they are?" He told her what he suspected, that Morse was likely having her property watched, gathering information about whether the eviction had been served and whether she was planning to leave voluntarily. He told her about his letter to the judge. He did not tell her everything he was thinking, because what he was thinking included things that were not relevant to her immediate safety, and that he needed to keep contained for his own stability. She listened to all of it with her characteristic precision and then said, I can document the surveillance. If they're watching the property, there will be tracks. I can cast impressions of the shoe patterns and compare them against the known horses in the more stable. I've seen those horses at the property line. He stared at her. You can cast shoe impressions. Plaster of Paris, she said simply. My father used it for soil samples. I have a small supply left. Walter Finley sat down on a hay bale and looked at Anna Lawson in the cold barn light, and felt something happen inside him that he recognized, distantly, as the kind of thing that happened only rarely and could not be undone once it had started. He had admired capable people his entire life. He had respected intelligence in anyone who possessed it. But he had never in his 31 years sat across from a woman, specifically in 1882 in Kansas, where a woman alone was supposed to be a liability rather than an asset, who was meeting a calculated conspiracy with a level of counterintelligence that was, to put it plainly, better than anything he could have designed himself. Cast the impressions, he said. I'll come back Monday. The second visit on Sunday was neither a patrol visit nor a fact-finding mission. He told himself it was both. He was not honest with himself again. He rode up at midday to find Anna and Clara sitting on the porch steps in the thin autumn sunshine, Anna reading aloud from a book, and Clara leaning against her shoulder with the absolute boneless comfort of a small child who feels perfectly safe. The image hit him somewhere unguarded, the ordinary peace of it, the rightness of it, the fragility of it given everything that was trying to take it apart. Anna looked up when she heard his horse. She did not change her posture or her expression significantly. She did close the book. Sunday, she said. It contained a question. I was in the area, he said, which was almost true, as he had ridden an extra 4 miles specifically to be in the area. Clara climbed to her feet and came down the porch steps with the directness of a 5-year-old who had decided she liked someone. Your horse has a white spot on his nose, she told Walter, examining the bay with serious interest. He does, Walter agreed. My papa had a horse with a white spot, Clara said. His name was Sunday. What's this one's name? She asked, already reaching toward the bay's nose with small, careful hands. I've been calling him Deputy, Walter said, and Clara laughed, a bright, clear sound that dispersed into the October air like the opposite of everything that had been weighing on the situation. He helped Anna review the plaster impressions she had taken that morning of the tracks near the north fence. They were good, clear, detailed, showing 2 distinct shoe patterns. He compared them against his mental files and confirmed his suspicion about one of them. The other he did not immediately recognize. They sat at the drafting table over the impressions and the maps, and the afternoon light came through the east window and lay in bars across the documents, and at some point Clara fell asleep on the rug near the fireplace and the house was quiet, and Walter became aware that he had been here for 2 hours and it had felt like 20 minutes. You should eat something, Anna said. It came out more personally than she had apparently intended, because she immediately looked slightly away. There's soup on the stove. If you're going to be here anyway, you should eat. That's very kind, he said. She fed him soup that was better than anything he had eaten in Colton County, because she was apparently also good at cooking, and he ate it at the kitchen table while she sat across from him with her own bowl, and they talked, really talked, not about evidence or judge circuits or land fraud, but about other things. About Ohio, where she had grown up. About the civil engineering projects her father had worked on. About the specific, patient way she had learned to love Kansas in all its harshness, the way the sky went on forever, the way the grass moved in wind like a living thing, the way the silence at night was a different kind of silence than anywhere she had lived before. He told her about Nebraska, where he had grown up, the son of a circuit minister who traveled and a mother who had raised him and his 3 brothers largely alone. He told her that he had gone into law because he believed in order, in the idea that a place could be made safe enough for ordinary people to build ordinary lives, and that someone had to stand in the gap between the people building and the people who preyed on them. She listened to him the way she did everything else, completely, carefully, with an intelligence that was fully present and not performing itself. "You're a good man, Deputy Finley," she said at the end of it. She said it in the same tone she used for factual observations, but her eyes over the rim of her cup were warmer than her voice. "Walter," he said. "You can call me Walter." She considered this with the gravity she gave everything. "Walter," she said, and it was only one word, but it felt like an agreement of some kind, a crossing of a small threshold between them. He rode back to Colton in the dark, and for the first time in 6 years of solitary law enforcement, the room above the livery felt very empty. Monday came with a cold snap that drove the temperature down hard. Walter went to the office. Greer was waiting. "Ors wants to know when the Lawson property will be available for his people to move in," Greer said. He was looking at Walter with an assessment in his eyes that was new, a faint suspicion, the beginning of calculation. "These things take time," Walter said. "She has to arrange to move her livestock. She should have thought about that before she started making trouble." Greer crossed to his desk. "Morse is losing patience, Finley. I need you to go back out there and make sure she understands the notice is final." Walter looked at him steadily. "I understand," he said. He did not ride to the Lawson property. He rode instead to the telegraph office and sent a message to the Federal Land Office in Topeka, referencing the fraudulent claim filed in Abilene and requesting a federal review on urgent grounds. He was careful with the language. He was careful with what he identified himself as. He sent the message and then went to the general store and bought a bag of coffee and a tin of tobacco that he did not actually want, because the telegraph operator was Greer's cousin, and he needed a reason to be in that part of town. He had 3 weeks until the judge arrived. Maybe. The response to the judge's letter came on Wednesday, brought by a rider from Wichita who found Walter at the livery rather than the office, which was not an accident. Judge Thorne had received Walter's letter. He had reviewed the evidence summary with considerable alarm. He was accelerating his circuit. He would arrive in Colton the last week of October, 10 days away. 10 days was manageable. 10 days was survivable, unless Morse decided to stop using legal mechanisms and use something else. The fire started on Thursday night, a week after Walter had torn up the eviction notice. It was not at the Lawson farmhouse. It was at the Beaumont barn 3 miles east, and Jacob Beaumont and his sons got it out before it spread, but it was a message. A clear, direct, unmistakable message. The patience for legal processes was running thin. Walter rode to the Beaumont farm at first light on Friday. Jacob Beaumont met him at the gate with a shotgun under his arm and the look of a man who had moved past fear into anger. "I know who sent them," Beaumont said. "I recognized one of the horses. Mercer Morse's foreman. I've seen that horse at my fence line before." Walter had. He pulled out his notebook and took the statement formally, witness and date and all particulars, and left Beaumont with a promise that the judge was 10 days away and the evidence was solid. He rode from Beaumont's to the Lawson property. He had not planned to. His feet simply directed his horse that direction with a certainty his conscious mind had not yet fully authorized. Anna was in the east field when he arrived, and she walked to meet him at the fence line with the plaster impression casts and a new piece of information. "Someone was at my north fence again last night," she said without preamble. She handed him the new impression. "Different horse this time. Smaller shoe, front left slightly worn, and they cut 3 of my fence posts." He looked at the impression and felt his jaw tighten. "They're escalating." "Yes," she said. She was holding herself very still, and he could see in the precise control of her posture what it was costing her. "Clara asked me this morning why we're not leaving. She heard me telling the Beaumont boy who came to check on us, and she understands more than she lets on." Walter looked at her across the fence line with the October wind cutting between them. He made a decision. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need to tell you because you deserve to make your own decisions with complete information." She waited. "Greer is going to know, if he doesn't already know, that I didn't truly serve that notice. When he finds out, he'll pull my badge and he might do worse. I think Morse has more reach in this county than a sheriff's office. He may have men who operate outside the law entirely. You're telling me you're in danger, she said. I'm telling you that both of us are in danger, and it's important you understand the full picture. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. And knowing that, she said carefully, you are still here. Yes, he said. Why? She asked, and it was the same question she had asked him the first time, but it meant something different now, and they both knew it. He looked at her across the fence line, this woman with her plaster impressions and her surveying equipment and her careful records and her child sleeping safe inside the farmhouse she had refused to abandon, and he said what was true in the plainest way he could. Because you are the most capable, most remarkable person I have encountered in a long time, he said. And because what is happening to you is unjust, and because I cannot in good conscience ride away from either of those things. He had left the personal and the professional deliberately intertwined in that sentence, and she heard both, and he could see her hear them. She did not respond to the personal part directly because she was careful with herself and careful with him, and the situation was still urgent. But something in her eyes was warm in the way it had been before, and she held his gaze for a beat longer than the professional required. The judge arrives in 10 days, she said finally. 10 days, he confirmed. Then we hold, she said. It was the language of a soldier, and she used it with a veteran's calm. He helped her repair the fence posts that afternoon. He did not plan to. He had his coat off and a post-hole digger in his hands within 20 minutes of arriving at the north line, because the fence needed fixing and she was going to do it alone if he didn't. She did not protest his help, which told him more than she probably intended. They worked together in the cold afternoon, and the work was good, physical, and purposeful and grounding in the way that only honest labor can be. She knew what she was doing. She handed him tools before he asked for them because she had already thought 3 steps ahead. Twice, their hands touched at the transfer of a tool, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them quite managed to pretend they hadn't noticed. When the fence was mended, she made coffee on the kitchen stove, and they stood in the kitchen with their cups and the fire going and Clara sitting at the table with a slate and chalk, practicing her letters with a seriousness that was her mother's in miniature. She writes beautifully, Walter said. She's been reading since 4, Anna said, with the kind of pride that contains its own restraint, as if she is trying not to claim too much credit for someone she loves too much to be objective about. Walter watched Clara form her letters for a moment and felt the full accumulated weight of what it would mean if Morse succeeded. Not just the land, not just the water access. The life in this kitchen, the coffee, the slate with letters on it, the careful, solitary work of a woman building something real out of grief and determination. He would not allow it. He stayed until the sun went down, and that evening at the kitchen table he and Anna worked through the legal strategy together, how to present the evidence to the judge, in what order with what witnesses to make the most airtight case. She was, unsurprisingly, already 3 steps ahead of him on most of it, but he knew the judge's procedural preferences from having appeared before him twice, and that knowledge proved useful in the organization of the presentation. They sat close together over her maps and documents, and the lamp made a warm circle of light around them, and by the end of the evening the strategy was solid and complete, and both of them knew it. He put on his coat to leave, and she stood in the doorway to see him out. The night was cold and clear, stars across the whole enormous Kansas sky. Walter, she said, and the use of his first name had become, in 4 days, a small, ordinary intimacy that was not ordinary at all. He turned. Be careful, she said. It was a simple sentence. It was not a simple sentence. Always, he said. He meant it both ways. He rode back to Colton under the stars and did not sleep well, and the reason he did not sleep well had less to do with the danger and more to do with a warm kitchen and a woman in a doorway. The situation broke open 5 days before the judge was due. Greer cornered Walter at the office on Monday morning with a flat, hard expression that meant he had been doing arithmetic, and the numbers had come up wrong. I sent Dawson out to the Lawson property Saturday, he said. Dawson was the county's other deputy, a soft-spoken, unreliable man who tended to go whichever way the wind blew. He said there was no sign anyone had cleared out. Said the woman was still there, working her field like nothing happened. Walter met Greer's eyes. She asked for more time to arrange transport for her cattle. I didn't authorize more time. Greer came around his desk. He was not a large man, but he carried authority like a physical fact, and his eyes right now were the eyes of someone who had realized he had a problem and was making calculations about how to resolve it. "Did you serve that notice, Finley?" "I went to the property," Walter said. It was precise and it was evasive, and it was the best he could do. "That's not what I asked." The silence held between them like a wire pulled to its limit. "She has documentation that contradicts the claim," Walter said. "Documentation from the land office in Abilene that establishes clear title. The secondary claim Morse filed is fraudulent deed. There is no survey. There was never a survey. I verified it myself." Greer's face went through several calculations very fast. "You've been working against this office," he said. "I've been working within the law," Walter said, "which is what I was hired to do." What happened next happened quickly. Greer reached for Walter's badge. Walter stepped back. Greer said, "You're done in this county, Finley. Hand over the badge and the gun and get out." Walter looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the 4 years of honest work he had put in. He thought about what it had cost him to get where he was. He thought about Anna Lawson at her drafting table, and Clara with her chalk and her slate, and the night sky over the Kansas plain. He unfastened the badge from his coat and held it in his hand for a moment, looking at it. "The judge arrives Friday," he said. "Whatever you do between now and then, the evidence is already in his hands. It's already in the federal land office in Topeka. You cannot put it back, Dade. What you can do is decide which side of this you want to be on when Marcus Thorne rides into this county." He set the badge on Greer's desk. He walked out of the office. He went directly to his room above the livery, packed his saddlebags, paid what he owed to the livery owner, and rode out of Colton at a pace that communicated purpose without announcing it. He did not look back. He rode to the Lawson farm. Anna came out to the porch when she heard him, and she looked at his coat where the badge was not, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside." He told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Will Greer go to Morse?" "He already has, probably," Walter said. "Morse will know the federal review is in progress. He'll know the judge is coming early. He may try to move fast before Thorne arrives." "How fast?" "Tonight, tomorrow at the latest." Her face did not change in its surface composure, but her hands, resting on the edge of the drafting table, pressed flat against the paper in a way that told him she was controlling something physical. Fear, anger, the combination of the two that produces a very particular kind of steady fury. "Clara is at the Beaumont farm," she said. "I sent her yesterday as a precaution." He looked at her. "That was wise. I had a feeling we were running out of time." She straightened. "I won't leave, Walter. I want to be absolutely clear about that. If they come tonight with a mob or with fire, I will be on this land." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to ask you to leave." She looked at him. "You have no badge. You have no official standing. What you're proposing is that you stay on this property as a private citizen and defend it." "Yes," he said. "That is an enormous risk for you." "Yes," he said again. And then, because they had been circling this for 10 days, and the urgency of the situation made the extended courtesy of indirection feel like a waste of something precious, he said, "I would like very much to stay, Anna, if you'll have me." The sentence was factual, and it was also more than factual, and she heard the more than. He could see her hear it. The wall that had been coming down slowly, over coffee and fence posts and maps and soup and lamplit evenings, came down a little further. "Stay," she said. It was also more than one word. He did. They set up that night with the practical efficiency of two people who were, in their different ways, accustomed to operating in dangerous situations. Walter checked the rifle. She had a Winchester 1873 in excellent condition, and the ammunition supply. Anna knew where both were, obviously, since the rifle was hers, and she had checked it herself that morning. He positioned himself where he could see the road and the north fence lines simultaneously. She positioned herself where she could see the barn and the east approach. They kept a lantern burning low, not enough to announce their position, but enough to see by. The night was long and cold and quiet for most of it. They talked in low voices to stay alert, and the talking moved between the practical and the personal in the natural way of people who are running out of reasons to maintain distance. She told him about Thomas, about the man he had been, steady and good and not brilliant but solid as good timber, who had loved her seriously and built this farm with her seriously, and who she would miss for the rest of her life. She said this with clarity and without sentimentality, in the way of a woman who has processed grief honestly and put it in its place without trying to bury it. He would have liked you, she said. He respected people who did their work honestly. Walter received this carefully, understanding what it was and what it was not. It was not permission. It was not a door closing. It was a woman placing something important in the record. "I'm sorry I didn't know him," Walter said. She looked at him across the dark room. "Are you?" she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite ironic and not quite anything else, but was absolutely present and deliberate. They were still sitting in that careful, charged silence when they heard the horses, 3 of them at the north fence, approaching slowly. Walter was on his feet and at the window in the same motion. Anna was beside him a breath later, the rifle in her hands, her posture completely composed. "3 riders," he said. "I see them," she said. He went to the door and stepped onto the porch before the riders reached the gate. He stood in the dark of the porch with his hand at his holster. He still had his gun, badge or no badge, and said, in the full, carrying voice he used when he needed to be clearly heard across distances, "Turn around. This property is under active federal review. Anyone who takes action against it tonight will be charged with interfering in a federal proceeding." The riders stopped. There was a consultation among them. In the dark, he could not make out faces, but he could see that one of them had the broad silhouette of Mercer, Morse's foreman. He called out again, "I know who you are, and I have documentation that will be in front of a federal judge in 4 days. If you ride away now tonight, you might still have time to make different decisions. If you don't, the charges you face will be considerably more serious than trespassing." Another consultation, longer this time. Anna stepped out onto the porch beside him. He was aware of her presence on his left with an acuteness that had nothing to do with the tactical situation, and everything to do with the fact that she had chosen to stand beside him in the open, visible and unafraid. And it was the most deliberate and also the most affecting thing he had ever seen anyone do. The riders turned. They rode away in the direction they had come, and the hoofbeats faded, and the Kansas night went quiet again, and Walter Finley stood on Anna Lawson's porch in the dark with his heart hammering and let out a breath that he had been holding for a considerable time. "They'll report back to Morse," he said. "Yes," Anna said. She was still holding the rifle. "But they didn't do anything tonight, and tomorrow is 1 day closer to Friday." She was right. She was always right. It was one of the things about her that made him feel, simultaneously, deeply competent and pleasantly unnecessary. He turned to look at her, and in the dark she was all dark hair and steady eyes and the particular light that comes off a person who has just faced a threat and found it, once again, not large enough to break them. "Anna," he said. "Walter," she said. And he kissed her, or she kissed him, or they moved toward each other at the same moment in the dark of the porch, with the October stars behind them and the Kansas wind going still for just that interval. And it was a kiss that contained 10 days of fence posts and coffee and maps and lamplit evenings, and the particular accumulated weight of 2 people who have been honest with each other in every way except this one. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him with an expression he could not fully read in the dark, but that contained, unmistakably, the look of someone who has just confirmed something they had already suspected and found the confirmation both satisfying and alarming. "We have a lot of things still to survive," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "We should go back inside," she said. "Yes," he agreed again. They did, and neither of them slept but for several different reasons than before. The next 3 days were a careful, tense-holding action. Walter stayed at the farm. The Beaumont boys rode a night patrol around the property at a distance, per a quiet arrangement Walter made with Jacob Beaumont, who was furious and also deeply pleased to have something productive to do with his fury. Morse's men did not return. Whether this was because Greer had told Morse about the Federal Review, or because the riders that night had reported something that gave Morse pause, or because Morse was making his own calculations about how much exposure he could afford, Walter did not know. What he knew was that each day that passed without incident was a day one. He brought Clara back from the Beaumont farm on the second day, because Clara was asking to come home, and because Anna, for all her composure, missed her daughter with a physical ache that she did not have to explain. Clara arrived back at the farm, surveyed the situation with the comprehensive perceptiveness of a child who missed nothing, looked at Walter with his saddlebags in the corner of the main room and said, "Are you staying here now?" "For a while," Walter said. Clara considered this. "Good," she said. "The fence posts need painting." Anna laughed, which was the first full, unguarded laugh he had heard from her, and it was extraordinary, bright and warm and real, everything her controlled exterior kept carefully contained, suddenly present in the kitchen. He carried that laugh with him for the rest of the day. Judge Marcus Thorne arrived in Colton on Thursday afternoon, a day early, because the telegram from Topeka had made the Federal Review official, and the circuit judge's schedule had been formally accelerated. He arrived with 2 federal marshal's men who wore their authority in a different register than county deputies, quiet and absolute, and he went directly to the hotel and sent a rider to the Lawson farm within the hour. The rider brought a note in the judge's handwriting. "Present your evidence tomorrow morning at 9. Bring your witnesses." Walter read the note to Anna and watched something release in her face that she had been holding tightly for a very long time. The hearing took place in the main room of the Colton Hotel, because it was the largest enclosed space in the county seat, and because the judge preferred proximity to the scene of dispute. Jacob Beaumont was there with his oldest son, both of them cleaned up and carrying written statements. Sarah Aldridge's brother had come with a deposition from Sarah. The clerk from the Abilene Land Office had been sent for and arrived, pale and nervous, carrying the original deed file. Harlan Morse was there as well, with his lawyer. They sat across the room from Anna with the studied nonchalance of men who expected the machinery of power to function in their favor. Dade Greer was not there. Walter had heard that morning that Greer had ridden out of Colton the previous night. Where he had gone, no one was certain, but the opinion in town was that he had made a calculation, and the calculation had told him to leave. Anna presented her evidence personally. She stood before Judge Thorne and laid out the case with the methodical clarity of a woman who had been preparing for this exact moment for months. She showed the deed. She showed the payment receipts. She showed the fraudulent secondary claim and the non-existent survey it referenced. She showed her surveyor's maps, and at the sight of them the judge paused and asked, "Who drew these?" "I did," Anna said. "Are you a trained surveyor, Mrs. Lawson?" "My father trained me," she said. "I have the reference documentation for all measurements." The judge studied the maps for a long, quiet moment. He looked at her over his glasses with an expression of frank assessment. "These are the finest hand-drawn survey maps I have seen presented as evidence in 20 years on the circuit," he said. "Continue." Morse's lawyer tried several objections, all of them procedurally weak, all of them disposed of by Judge Thorne with patient efficiency. When the lawyer attempted to argue that the secondary claim had been filed in good faith based on information received, the judge requested the source of that information. The lawyer could not produce it. The source did not exist because the claim was fabricated, and when the Abilene land clerk testified to the chain of custody of the deed file and confirmed that the secondary claim had been filed by a person using credentials they could not verify, the lawyer sat down and did not stand up again. Morse himself sat very still throughout all of this. He was a man who had operated for years at the edge where power and law overlapped, and he was experienced enough to know when the overlap was gone. By the time Anna placed the letter from the Dodge City Speculator before the judge, the letter referencing the final obstacle, and the corridor, Morse's face had gone the particular gray of a man who is doing arithmetic very fast and arriving at very bad numbers. Judge Thorne ruled before noon. The secondary claim was voided. The original deed was confirmed as fully valid. The Lawson property was, in the court's finding, unambiguously and completely the property of Anna Lawson, widow of Thomas Lawson, with no encumbrance of any kind. The judge further ordered a federal investigation into the pattern of land acquisitions documented in Anna's survey maps, with specific reference to the role of intimidation and fraudulent filings in Morse's methods. Harlan Morse was not arrested that day. The federal investigation would take time, but he was formally notified that he was a subject of inquiry, which meant that his attorney spent the next 20 minutes whispering urgently in his ear while Morse sat with his gray face and his calculating eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, found that the calculation was not going his way. Walter stood against the back wall of the hotel room throughout the proceedings, because he had no official standing to be at the table and he knew it, and he watched Anna Lawson dismantle a conspiracy that had been designed to destroy her, with nothing but intelligence and preparation, and an absolute refusal to be moved. And he was so full of something that he had no immediate word for it that he had to look at the ceiling for a moment to maintain his composure. After it was over, after the judge had signed his order and the federal marshals had served notice on Morse, and the room had emptied in stages, Anna came to where Walter was standing and she looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, and there was so much in them: relief, exhaustion, triumph, the lingering tremor of all the fear she had not shown, that he did not try to speak. He simply opened his arms and she came into them, and she pressed her face against his chest and he held her, and the only sound was the October wind finding gaps in the hotel walls. She pulled back after a moment and looked up at him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "What will you do now?" she asked. She was asking about his badge, his position, his place in Colton County without a sheriff's office to work from. "I have some ideas," he said. "There will need to be a new sheriff since Greer has apparently decided the situation no longer suits him. The county will need someone to fill that role." She looked at him steadily. "And you would want that role." "I would want to stay in this county," he said, "for several reasons, some of which are professional." The warmth in her eyes deepened. "Several," she said. "At least several," he said. They rode back to the Lawson farm in the thin afternoon light, and Clara was waiting on the porch with the Beaumont boy who had been looking after her, and she ran across the yard at the sight of them with her dark hair flying and her arms already reaching, and Anna caught her and held her up and pressed her face against her daughter's neck and closed her eyes. Walter watched from his horse and felt the weight of 4 years of solitary law enforcement settle and then lift. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that changed the shape of a life. The county commissioners, faced with an empty sheriff's office and a federal investigation that made everyone within a 20-mile radius nervous about their own conduct, offered Walter the position of interim sheriff, with the strong implication that the interim designation would not last long if he was willing to stay. He accepted. He moved his saddlebags from the room above the livery to a small house on the edge of Colton that came with the position, and he was honest with himself about the fact that the house being 3 miles from the Lawson farm was not a coincidence he had disregarded. Harlan Morse was arrested 5 weeks later by federal marshals who had spent those weeks doing the work that Anna's documentation had made possible. The investigation confirmed what she had suspected and documented the deliberate acquisition of water access through fraud and intimidation, 3 years of coordinated effort, and direct involvement in at least 2 of the fires that had driven smaller farmers off their land. Morse would not see the outside of a federal prison for a considerable number of years. Dade Greer was found in Dodge City, offered a deal by the federal investigators in exchange for testimony, and took it. He did not return to Colton. The Beaumont farm survived and expanded. Sarah Aldridge's farm survived. 3 families who had sold under pressure and moved on were notified that their claims were being reviewed by the Federal Land Office, and 2 of them returned to repurchase land that had been taken from them. Anna Lawson's 160 acres of bottomland sat secure and undisputed in the middle of all of this, fed by the water that Morse had failed to take from her. Walter came to the farm most days. He came first in his official capacity. There were legitimate matters of county business that intersected with the Lawson property, between the investigation and the paperwork resulting from the judge's order, and then in capacities that were not official but were increasingly acknowledged as something else. He came for dinner. He came to help with the cattle when Anna's hired hand had a family illness and was away for a week. He came to read to Clara, who had decided that his reading voice was the correct reading voice for the stories she liked best, and was not shy about saying so. He came because the Lawson farm had become, quietly and without his planning it, the place he most wanted to be. Anna let him come. More than that, she made coffee when she heard his horse, and she saved things to tell him about the day. And once, when the weather turned sharp in mid-November and he arrived with cold on his coat, she handed him a cup and held his cold hands for a moment between hers to warm them. And the touch was so natural and so deliberate that it said, in the plainest language possible, that she had stopped practicing careful restraint. On a Sunday in November, the first real snow of the season lying white and clean across the fields, Walter arrived at the farm with something in his coat pocket that had been there for a week while he tried to decide on the timing. He was usually decisive. He was usually the first person in any situation to commit to a course of action. This particular decision had made him, uncharacteristically, tentative, not because he doubted the decision, but because it mattered more than anything he had ever decided, and the weight of that made him want to be sure of everything before he moved. He was sure. He was absolutely sure. He found Anna at the drafting table with new maps spread before her, not evidence maps this time, but agricultural maps, soil composition charts, drainage patterns for the coming spring planting. She was planning the next season with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything, and she looked up when he came in with snow on his shoulders and said, "You look like you've been deciding something on the ride over." "I have," he said. She waited. He sat down across the table from her, which was not quite where he had imagined doing this, but he realized that across a table covered in her maps and charts was, in fact, exactly the right place, because it was where he had first understood who she was, and who she was the entire reason for this conversation. "I want to marry you," he said. He had considered and discarded a dozen longer speeches. This was the true one, and the true one was the only one worth saying to her. "I want to marry you, and I want to help you build what you are building here, and I want to be Clara's father if she will have me as one, and I want to make a life with you on this land. I am aware that the timeline of our acquaintance is brief and that you have a great deal to consider and that you will take exactly as long as you need to think about it." She looked at him across the maps. Her expression was doing several things at once. It was warm and amused and serious and surprised, though less surprised than he had expected, which told him she had also been doing some considering of her own. "Walter," she said. "Anna," he said. "I surveyed this," she said. There was something in her voice that was very close to laughing. "I beg your pardon. The situation," she said. "I surveyed it in my head over the past several weeks. I measured all the relevant features and cross-referenced them against the available data." She paused. "The evidence supports the conclusion that this is a good idea." He felt something break open in his chest again, the way it had the first time on the frost-hard ground in front of her farmhouse, except warmer, much warmer. "And your professional opinion," he said. She stood up from the table and came around to his side and looked at him with everything she felt in her storm-gray eyes, and she said, "My professional opinion is yes." He stood up and kissed her properly this time, with the snow outside the window and the fire behind them, and it was nothing like the uncertain thing on the porch in the dark. It was certain and thorough, and it tasted slightly of the coffee she had been drinking, and completely of the fact that this was right. Clara, who had been in the back room, appeared in the doorway with her cloth doll and surveyed the scene with the comprehensive perceptiveness she had inherited from her mother. "Are you going to be my papa?" she asked Walter with the same directness she brought to every question. "If you want me to be," Walter said. Clara thought about this for the length of time it took her to establish it was a real question rather than a rhetorical one. "Yes," she said, "but you have to let me name your horse." Walter looked at Anna. Anna was fighting a smile with moderate success. "She's already named it," Anna said. "She's been calling it Biscuit for 2 weeks." Walter looked at his horse, tied at the fence post, visible through the window with the snow settling on its bay coat and its white-nosed face turned toward the house with the particular expression of a horse that knows very well it is being discussed. "Biscuit," Walter said. "It's a good name," Clara said firmly. "It's an excellent name," Walter said. They were married in December, in the Colton church, with Jacob Beaumont and his sons in attendance and Sarah Aldridge standing up with Anna and the judge from Wichita, Marcus Thorne, attending as a guest because he had taken a personal interest in the outcome of the case, and had corresponded with Anna twice since the hearing about a separate matter involving fraudulent surveying in 3 adjacent counties, for which he wanted her expertise. Anna wore a dress the color of deep blue sky, and she walked to the front of the church with Clara holding her hand on one side and Jacob Beaumont, who was the closest thing she had to family in this county, having been Thomas Lawson's neighbor, and something like a substitute uncle on the other. Walter stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and felt the full accumulated weight and meaning of the previous 2 months and the life that was beginning at the end of them. The ceremony was simple and direct, in the way of frontier weddings, which did not have time for elaborate theater, but which understood that the words mattered precisely because they were not theatrical but true. They said the words. They meant them. Everyone in the church who had known what winter was coming for this woman, and who had watched her face it down, could see that they meant them. The winter after the wedding was the kind of winter that tests whether a life is solid enough to hold its shape under pressure. It was cold and hard, and the cattle had difficulties, and there were 3 separate blizzards between January and March that kept everyone close to home and tested nerves in the way that extended confinement always does. Walter and Anna passed it well. They passed it, in fact, with a satisfaction he had not anticipated, not despite the difficulties but partly because of them, because working through hard things together with someone capable and honest is one of the most efficient ways of establishing whether a partnership is real, and theirs was real. They disagreed occasionally, mostly about practical matters, and the disagreements were resolved with the same methodical attention to evidence that Anna brought to everything. She was never wrong because she refused to hold a position without data. He was occasionally wrong and said so without drama. This suited them both. Clara adapted to their new configuration with the pragmatic efficiency of a child who had decided the outcome was satisfactory and saw no reason to complicate it. She called Walter by his first name for 6 weeks, then one morning called him Papa without apparent premeditation, and then went immediately back to eating her porridge as if she had not just rearranged the emotional landscape of the kitchen. Walter excused himself to check on the horses and stood in the cold barn for a while, doing nothing in particular. In the spring, the federal land case against Morse concluded. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, a significant result that was attributed in large part to the quality of the documentary evidence presented, a point the federal prosecutor made explicitly in his summary, citing the surveyor's maps produced by Anna Lawson Finley as the most comprehensive private survey documentation I have encountered in my professional career. Anna received a letter from the General Land Office in Washington the following week, asking if she would be willing to provide consulting services on a fraudulent survey case in another county, at a fee that was more than most men in this county earned in a month. She showed Walter the letter at the kitchen table. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "You could hire another farmhand," he said, "and take the consulting case." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "Separately, Judge Thorne has written again. He would like me to prepare an expert report on the survey records in the adjacent county fraud case." Walter looked at his wife across the kitchen table with his coffee in his hand and felt the particular quality of happiness that comes from being in the company of someone who surprises you regularly and well. "You are going to be the most formidable frontier surveyor in Kansas," he said. "In Kansas," she said. He laughed. "Apologies." "The most formidable in the territory." "Nationally," she said primly, and went back to her letter. The farm prospered. Anna took 2 consulting cases that year and 1 the following year, and her work began to be known among federal land officials as exceptionally reliable, a reputation that would grow over the following decade into something considerably larger. The water access that Morse had tried to steal remained available to the independent farmers of the county, and the corridor that would have broken them was broken instead, and the small farms along it held and expanded and fed families who would not otherwise have made it. Walter served as sheriff of Colton County for the next 11 years, and the county became, during that time, a place that small farmers and independent settlers could come to and find the law working on their behalf rather than against them, not perfectly, not without struggle, but consistently and honestly. He was not the kind of sheriff who made speeches. He was the kind who showed up and did the work and went home to his family at the end of the day. In the 2nd year of their marriage, their son was born, a boy they named Thomas, for the man who had built this farm and loved Anna seriously and had deserved a better fate than fever at 32. Thomas Walter Finley arrived in March on a cold, clear day, red-faced and loud, and Clara examined him with the evaluative seriousness she brought to all new data and declared him acceptable, which was high praise from Clara. Walter held his son in the farmhouse where he had first understood what Anna Lawson was made of, and the feeling was so large it had no shape he could put words to, so he did not try. Clara, at 7, had developed an interest in her mother's surveying work and had begun to ask, with systematic persistence, to be taken along on field days. Anna began teaching her, as her own father had taught her with the same patient and exacting instruction, how to hold a compass, how to read a plat map, how to measure a distance with a chain and account for slope and terrain. Clara was good at it, which surprised no one who had spent any time with her. 2 years after Thomas, a second child arrived, a girl they named Ruth, for Walter's mother, who had raised 4 sons largely alone in Nebraska and had never been thanked adequately. Ruth was quieter than her brother and steadier, and from very early on she watched everything with dark eyes that missed nothing, and everyone who knew the family said she was her mother's daughter entirely, which Anna received as the highest compliment she had been given. The farm on the Colton County bottomland grew into a place that people in the county spoke of with a particular kind of respect, not because of its size or its productivity, though both were considerable, but because of what it represented. It was the land that had been fought for honestly and held by something more than force. It was the place where a woman alone had stood her ground with a ledger and a transit and a precise, meticulous intelligence, and had won. Anna's consulting practice grew through referrals and reputation into something that occupied, by the time Thomas was in school, 2 full days of her week and the occasional trip to Wichita or Topeka to present findings in person. Judge Thorne, who had become something like a professional patron, referred her work to 3 other circuit judges. She was, in 1890, hired by the Kansas State Board of Agriculture to assist in reviewing disputed surveys across 6 counties. A contract that was unprecedented for a private individual, let alone a woman, and that she accepted with the composed satisfaction of someone who has seen exactly this outcome coming for some time. Walter drove her to the train station for her first official trip to Topeka in the family wagon on a clear September morning, with Thomas and Ruth on the seat between them and Clara, at 14, sitting in the back with her mother's survey equipment case on her lap, with the care of someone transporting something precious. At the station, with the train making its preliminary sounds and the other passengers assembling on the platform, Anna turned to Walter and said, in the pragmatic and direct way she said everything, "I will be back Thursday. Clara knows where the cold larder is. Thomas is not to eat all the bread in one day." "Understood," Walter said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The years were there between them, the eviction notice tearing in the October wind, the fence posts, the cold barn and the plaster impressions, the porch in the dark, the lamplit evenings over maps. Everything it had cost and everything it had built. "Walter," she said. "Anna," he said. "You tore up that notice," she said. He smiled, the slow, real smile that she had been among the first people to see and that the children had inherited in their own ways. "Best decision I ever made," he said. She kissed him briefly, efficiently, the way she did most things, and boarded the train. He watched it go from the platform with Thomas leaning against his leg and Ruth on his hip, and Clara beside him already asking if she could carry the wagon reins on the way home. He said yes to all of it. He drove his family home through the September morning with the Kansas sky going on forever in every direction, and the grass moving in the wind like a living thing. And the farm was ahead of them on the road, the farmhouse and the barn, and the fence line that had been mended together, and the east field where he had first seen her walking a measuring chain in the autumn light. The life they had built was solid and real and earned. It had been built out of a torn piece of paper and a leather satchel full of evidence, and the kind of fierce, capable, unbreakable love that does not ask for rescue, but recognizes a partner and extends a hand. Anna came home from Topeka on Thursday as promised, with a commission for a second state survey project and a letter of commendation from the Board of Agriculture that she read once and then filed in the records cabinet, because she did not keep things unless they were useful, and she already knew what she was capable of. She came through the farmhouse door at dusk to find Walter at the kitchen stove, which was not his natural element but which he had been occupying with conscientious effort, with Thomas at the table doing sums, and Ruth asleep on the rug near the fire in Clara's boots, by the door indicating she was somewhere on the property doing something that probably involved a measuring chain. Anna set her bag down. She looked at the scene with the comprehensive, assessing attention she brought to everything. "You burned the biscuits," she said. "I did," Walter agreed, "and Thomas did not eat all the bread." "I had considerable help preventing that," Walter said. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him with the full, deliberate warmth that was also one of the truest things in his life, and he held her for a moment in the kitchen with the burned biscuits and the sleeping child and the sums on the table and the October dark coming down outside the window. "Tell me everything," he said. She did. She always did. And that was the shape of it, the life that had been built from the moment a deputy rode up to a farmhouse with a fraudulent eviction notice in his hand, and a woman walked down her porch steps with a leather satchel, and the evidence to prove that no power on the Kansas plain was large enough to take from her what was hers. The notice was long gone, scattered on the wind in 2 pieces on a frost-hard morning in 1882. What replaced it was 160 acres of good bottomland, a farmhouse full of children and books and maps, a man who had found his purpose in honest work in an unexpected place, a woman who had surveyed the terrain with every tool she had and found it worth holding. And the stars at night above the Kansas plain, going on and on without end, the way they always had and always would, over a farm that stood,